and Jake as well. So over the last couple of weeks, we have been studying together this concept of thriving. And I've said to you that throughout the Old Testament, the people of God are regularly praying not just for God to rescue them, but for Him to make them thrive. And one of those places is in Psalm chapter 1. And so over these 4 weeks together, this is week 3, we've been looking through Psalm 1 pretty slowly and asking the question, what would it mean for us to join in that prayer? That we would pray to God regularly that He would cause us to thrive. And what would it mean to not only just pray that prayer, but to actually follow Psalm 1 in leaning into that reality? Like, what do we have to do to lean into it? And so if you were with us week 1, you realize, well, we've got to deal with the issue of sin in our lives. Sin is a path away from blessing. But thanks be to God, through Jesus, He has made that way possible for us. And then last week we talked about the posture that leads to blessing, and it's a posture of meditating or murmuring, repeating constantly the truth of the gospel to yourself so that it centers you and changes you and grows your love for God, because when we love God, we obey God. And when we're living God's way, God intends to cause us to thrive. Today, the question we want to ask, and maybe would have made for a better sermon 1, except the psalm waits until verse 3 to get to it, is, so what on earth is thriving anyway? You've been asking yourself that question. We have modern definitions and understandings of it, but let's look into the Old Testament and really try to study this word and get to the bottom of this question. What does God mean when He uses thrive? And in so doing, we'll also ask sometimes the question, what do I mean? And how might those two things be divergent sometimes so that it's helpful for us? And then not only what does it mean, but what would it look like in your life? What would thriving look like? And then next week when we're together, when we'll finish this all up, we'll talk about what it means to be rooted and planted in the right places in life so that we can thrive. So if you've copied the scriptures, you can turn to Psalm chapter 1. Remember, we're reading from the New American Standard Version just these couple of weeks because I like particularly the translation of Psalm 1. But your versions are wonderful as well, so feel free to follow along with them. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in His law he meditates day and night. He'll be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season. Its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he thrives. The wicked are not so. They're like chaff, which the wind drives and blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the day of judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. The word of God for the people of God. So the question before us this morning is, centrally, what does it mean to thrive? I've called us to pray for it. I've talked about a posture towards it. What exactly is it? What does it mean? And central to the whole reality, the most important thing before we go any deeper into this Old Testament word is the reality that it is a God-caused reality. Right? The truth that it is a God-caused reality. I've talked to you before that in the Hebrew language, there's all kinds of different forms of verbs. It makes for struggles in translation and grammar, but it's super helpful sometimes in translating because we know the intention that the author has. And one of the forms of verb is what's called causation. And every time this verb is used, it's used in that form. In essence, the prayer is not, let me thrive. The prayer is, God, cause me to thrive. And same in Psalm 1 here, that God causes this tree that's planted by streams of water to thrive. What this means inherently for us is that thriving is not the result of self-effort. That's super hard for modern individualistic Western Americans, isn't it? Because we work hard for the things that we want. That's what we're taught. Now, this is not a sermon that would suggest to you, hey, start being lazy because God will cause you to thrive. Not at all. You should work hard. But we're working from identity, not for identity. Those are not semantics. That's the gospel. And so it is here that God causes us to thrive. Now, think about it with me for just a second. In our modern world and in our individual lives, how many hours and days and weeks and years have been spent and devoted to trying to build an identity for ourselves, have been spent trying to create value around ourselves, either internally or externally, have been spent trying to gain significance, acceptance, security, all of these internal realities. And at the core of this message, the truth is that all of that is actually wasted energy. Now, again, I'm not telling you you shouldn't work hard at your job. I'm not telling you you shouldn't be responsible with your resources. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't be someone who is actively engaged in all of these things, but you're moving towards them on the basis of what God has done for you, not to accomplish it on your own terms or by your own means. This is central to the reality of thriving. Because in our world today, we have more than anyone has ever had at any time in the course of history. And yet, studies have shown that we are the most discontent, unhappy people who have ever lived. Why is that? Because we don't understand what it means to thrive. It's kind of like what the prophet Haggai says. He says, you earn all of this money, but you put it in pockets with holes. What does he mean? All of our effort can never lead to an internal contentment, a true satisfaction. In essence, the Rolling Stones were incredibly biblical when they wrote the song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, right? That song, whether you like the lyrics or not, at its core is all about the modern world's consumption and trying to gain things, and that everyone tells us the more you can get, the more you can gain, the more you can build, the more satisfied you are. And what they wrote is the very same thing the Bible is telling us, that it actually is not true. It's a lie that we believe because we look at quantity of things and think that it will equate to internal quantity when it never does. Instead, the psalmist is reminding us that true thriving, true internal satisfaction only comes from God. And it increases by God, not by us. So with that said, let's dive a little more deeper into this word and try to figure out exactly what it means. Before we do that, let's talk about what it does not mean. Because this concept has been misused and abused by the modern church. Perhaps you've heard of churches that will use language like this and promote what's often called a prosperity gospel, that is wealth and health, right? You name it and you claim it. God wants to give you all of these physical possessions. I heard a preacher the other day talking about how he has the biggest house in the entire state because God's causing him to thrive. Now, I don't want to speak against his house, but I can speak against his theology. That is not what this means. God does not promise you wealth and health. That is not what thriving is. Thriving is much more holistic and much more internal than those realities. Friends, if you find yourself lured towards a prosperity gospel in any which way, by the way, almost all of the time, crazy enough, they're asking you to give them money, right? God will give them everything they need. Please send us $20 a month. It doesn't really make sense, does it? If you find yourself entangled with that in any way, can I just speak to you directly? That's a false gospel. You need to get rid of it, disown it, push it to the side, reject it for what it is, and remember who God actually is. At the same level, thriving is also not what I would call personal ambition. Now, this is a little more subtle, and this is an easier trap for many of us to fall into. Because oftentimes our prayer lives look a little bit like this. I'll let you into my prayer life, right? I'm not trying to judge any of you, just you judge me. God, here are the things I would like to happen this week. Please bless them, right? Here's my plan for the next 6 months of Hope Alliance Church. Would you bless it? Cause it to thrive. Now, we might look at that and say, well, that's a good prayer. And at some level it is, right? But did you catch who's central to that prayer? It's me. What am I asking God to do? God, use your magic wand, abracadabra, whatever it takes, and boom, give me everything that I need to make this happen. Thriving is not, at its core, about God blessing my plans. It's about me joining God's plans. You see it? This is not semantics, church. This is really important. It does not mean that in your prayers you can't wrestle through these things and ask for God's blessing on your plans. Just when it doesn't come to fruition, don't blame God for not causing you to thrive. Realize you're in an ongoing internal wrestle of figuring out what is God's and what's mine. Does it make sense? So when we preach this sermon, we're not talking about, hey, if you do these 1, 2, 3 things, then God's going to, boom, make everything that you want to happen, happen. That's not thriving. Thriving at its core is about participating, not about consuming. That's hard for us because as modern Western Americans, most of our life is built around consumption. We don't like to think about it that way, but it really is. We do the things we want to do. We do the things that give us the most pleasure. But God is saying thriving is not me giving you the whole menu of the things that you think would be the most pleasurable in life. Thriving is an invitation for you to join me in what I'm doing in the world, to regain your human purpose in this world, to, as one of my favorite authors says, to reconnect to what it means to truly be human again. You know, our problem in our world at its core is we're human beings who actually don't know how to be human beings. And God is saying, if you would re-enter the paradigm that I've created, you would flourish in your humanity. It's about participating with God, not about consuming from God. Do you see this? Super important. So then what is thriving? Enough about what it isn't. What is it? And let me suggest 3 things to you. And these 3 things come from uses of this very same verb as is in Psalm 1 and other places in the Old Testament that give us a robust picture of the term. The first is the idea of growth, right? Thriving comes from growth. This is what we call spiritual growth. So listen to what the writer of Proverbs says in Proverbs chapter 28. He says, whoever conceals their sin does not thrive, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. This is a fascinating way to put it, isn't it? That the sin keeps us from thriving. That doesn't surprise us. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. But the opposite of not prospering is finding mercy. Right? In essence, falling on the truth of who God is, believing in His goodness, and enabling Him to let you thrive. Listen, true thriving in life is a move away from sinfulness, yes, but as Rachel said so eloquently earlier, it is not a move into spiritual performance. It's a move into a fuller embrace of God's mercy in your life that transforms you internally, that leads to all kinds of external transformations. Do you see it? The Proverbs writer doesn't say, whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses them and goes out and does all these incredible things for God, they thrive. That's not what he says. So if we're regularly dealing with our sin, if we're moving away from it, but in so doing, if we're falling on the mercy of God, that is that muttering the gospel to ourselves continually, that God's love for God is growing in us, it transforms us outside, that's what thriving looks like. That's part of what thriving is. Point one. Point two, thriving is about success. Right? That's why oftentimes in the Old Testament, the word is translated prosper or succeed. Now, I choose thrive on purpose because, man, as modern Western Americans, that word success is really hard to define biblically, isn't it? We've got a very solid understanding of what that word means, and so it's super hard to redefine. Success or prosperity. So let's look at Nehemiah chapter 2 as an example of this, although most of the references to this verb have this idea, success or prospering. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 20 said, I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us thriving. The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in it, Jerusalem, or any claim or historic right to it. If you're familiar at all with the book of Nehemiah, and I understand, yawn, Old Testament history, let me fill you in. Nehemiah, the Israelites had been kicked out of their land, conquered by the Babylonians, sent into exile. Everything is bad. But God had promised that he would restore them back to the land. And he actually did it through a unique way. He rose up a foreign power, the kingdom of Persia, under the leadership of Cyrus, who conquered the Babylonians and said about all of these disparate Jewish people who were there, what are we going to do with these people? Let's send them back to their land. Fascinating how God moves in history in crazy ways. It actually says in the book of Isaiah that God directed Cyrus's heart. Now, we are under no false assumption that Cyrus was a believer in God or would acknowledge even the truth of who God is. And yet, our God accomplishes his purposes for his glory. And so the people are coming back, but when they come back, they find their big capital city of Jerusalem in ruins. And they find all kinds of people around it who are, let's just say, not thrilled that they're coming back, that they're moving back into the neighborhood. And there's this guy who was a cupbearer in Persia, but who is Jewish. His name's Nehemiah, who gets this vision from God, this belief from God, this deep passion in his heart when he hears of the struggles of the people who are returning, that he wants to go back and help them. And chief amongst his jobs is he's going to help them rebuild the wall around the city. So when he's praying this prayer in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 20, that God would cause them to succeed or to thrive, he's talking about the rebuilding of the wall around the city. Does that make sense? So what you have here is an example, and this happens all throughout the Old Testament, of thriving happen in deep connection to God's people who are on God's mission. Does it make sense? This was not Nehemiah's plans, but this was something that God had raised up in him. When God's people are on God's mission, God causes them to thrive in that mission, to succeed or prosper in that mission. So we look at it this way, that a big part of thriving is not just growing spiritually. A big part of thriving is succeeding or prospering in your calling and in your participation in God's mission. Does it make sense? Now think about that with me for just a second. All of us share, as human beings, a unique calling. All of us share a collective calling. We'll talk about unique in a second. All of us share a collective calling. The New Testament is pretty clear. In fact, the whole Bible is pretty clear. That central to our calling as human beings, core to what it means to be human, is that we're image bearers of God. That's part of who we are. When we're praying for God to cause us to thrive, we're praying for him to cause us to thrive in that calling or mission. Does it make sense? Now, if he gives us a great week, that would be super good too. But to thrive in that mission, to truly bear his image to the world, so that the world would see God for who he is, not all the lies and the caricatures of him that are out there in this world. In the same way, we all share a corporate mission, a collective mission in the New Testament on the basis of Jesus to be witnesses, do we not? Or to make disciples, as the book of Matthew would put it. That we're called not just to collectively bear his image, but to draw people into relationship with Jesus so that they might follow him and gain this life that you and I have found therein. When we're calling on God to cause us to thrive, we're asking him to cause us to thrive in those callings and missions. Do you see it? But those callings and missions are central to what it means to be human. Set aside the collective for a minute, and I would suggest that each of us also bear unique callings. There's a reason why we are all not the same. We all look different, have different passions, different interests, are part of different families, live in different places. God knows what he's doing on that because he's given us unique callings. Think about it for a minute. Familially, each of us have a unique calling. Whether as a child, whether as a parent, an aunt, or an uncle, a nephew, whatever it is in your familial relationship, God has put you in that clan for a purpose. You see it? And so it is right for you to ask God to cause you to thrive in that environment. Not according to what you want to accomplish there, but according to what he's called you to be and to do in that place. Likewise, relationally, he's put us in spheres of influence on purpose and connected to. What would it mean to thrive in those places? Or vocationally, we talk about this a good bit, probably not enough. That each of you in your vocations are not just twiddling your thumbs, right? And I don't mean that by meaning you're not busy. I mean it's spiritually important what you are doing. Your job is not important because it gives you money so that you can get by. Your job is not important because it gives you money so you can help support the church. Your job is not important because it might give you opportunity to bear witness to the gospel. All of those things are wonderful results. But at the core, the Bible is central in telling us that our vocation is actually part of holistic worship to God. Martin Luther said it often, that listen, it's through our human vocation that God oftentimes delivers on his promises to his people. You're part of that in what you do. You don't have to be pastor vocationally or missionary vocationally to believe that your job is deeply spiritually important. What you're doing is significant. What would it mean for you to ask God to cause you to thrive in what you are doing? Not for your personal gain, but to live into the calling that you have in that vocation. And then ecclesiologically, and that's a big word, I'm talking about our church, right? You've got a calling here. You're not a consumer here. We hope that you love the music and the teaching and the kids ministry and the youth ministry. All of those things are meant to be blessing. But at the core, we've joined together as a people of God, those of you who call this place home. And so we have an obligation to each other, don't we? We have a calling to each other to bear one another's burdens, to encourage one another, to lift one another up. And we have a calling to this organization called the church. What would it mean to thrive in that environment, not to back out of it or just be a consumer? This is what thriving looks like in the Christian life. Third idea of thriving and what it would look like is what I'll call the fullness of life or satisfaction, right? Joshua 1, verse 8. This is probably the verse or the concept that the psalmist is pulling directly from when he writes this entire psalm. If you remember, Joshua is the leader who's going to lead the people into the land of promise, the place of bounty and life, the Old Testament picture of what full life looks like. With God in his land, totally provided for, significant, accepted, secure, everything as it should be. And this is what the Lord says to Joshua. It says, keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will thrive and be successful. incredible. What does he mean by thrive? He means it holistically there. Do you see it? At the core, what he's talking about is in the external realities of thriving, both in our growth and in the success of the mission and calling that God has given us, when we engage again in what it means to be human by doing those things, suddenly there is a level of internal satisfaction that is not accessible apart from those realities. And Joshua is called into that very experience here. What would it mean for us to thrive, to grow spiritually, to engage in our calling and mission intentionally, and to once again participate in God's understanding of what it means to be human, not our rebellious, sinful creation of it. This is what leads to inner satisfaction. So what does that then look like? Well, the psalmist writes in Psalm 1 a couple of things. He says, this tree's leaf does not wither. Right? A fascinating statement, isn't it? The leaf does not wither. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with fall. I really do. I love the weather. It's fantastic. I love being able to go outside and not within 30 seconds beginning to sweat. Right? It's a wonderful thing. Humidity is gone. The weather is just perfect. Here's my hate with fall. The trees are full of withering leaves that fall all over the place, right? And I can't go outside without looking at leaves that need to be collected, and they just are the bane of my existence in so many different ways. So I read this psalm and I think, oh, this is glory. What if we had fall without withering leaves? I know some of you are like, oh, but then they would be so beautiful, the colors, they're orange and yellow and brown. I love do you ever hear Jim Gaffigan? He's a fantastic comedian. He says, why is it that we love to go around in the fall and watch things die? I say exactly. What would it be like if there were trees whose leaves didn't wither? The psalmist is rightly juxtaposing thriving to withering. Do you see it here? That is, the opposite of thriving is withering. The opposite of withering is thriving. The prophet Jeremiah picks up on this, and a little bit later on in history expounds a little bit on it. That's what he says in Jeremiah chapter 17. He said, blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. He goes on, they will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. This is my picture of perfection. It has no worries in a year of drought, and it never fails to bear fruit. Thankful for Jeremiah and his fleshing out this idea of a leaf that does not wither. See two main points here? The first one is that a thriving person, a thriving tree, is not afraid of the seasons of life. Fascinating, isn't it? What Jeremiah doesn't say here, and what the New Testament and Old Testament regularly also do not say, is that there will not be seasons of life, right? The miracle of this is that the tree's leaves are always green. It isn't that the hard seasons go away. Oh, there'll suddenly be no more winter. The miracle is that somehow the leaves are always green, even in winter. That's thriving. Fascinating, isn't it? The Bible does not promise that we won't go through seasons. Some that are challenging, some that are less so. Some that are really hard, some that are full of joy and happiness. But the picture of thriving is of a tree or of a person who does not fear the varying seasons of life. Not because they lie to themselves about them. The two things this doesn't mean. I need to pause and say this at the fear of running over time, right? First thing this doesn't mean is that they're lying to themselves. Oh, that's not that bad. We do that as Christians sometimes, don't we? We feel like to be spiritual, we have to lessen how hard something actually is. Well, it's been a rough season, but it's not too bad. No, tell the truth. It's really hard. However, that's how you speak the gospel. In the same way, oh, I forgot point two. That's because I'm not supposed to run down this rabbit trail. At any rate, a tree or a person that is not fearful of the changing of the seasons. Why? Because of where they are planted. Do you see it? They know that they are close by to the stream that nourishes them. That stream is unchanged by the season. They understand that no matter the winds that come or the rains that fall or whatever else is out there in the circumstances, where they are, the rootedness will sustain them. It is not a falsifying of the reality of the struggle. The second thing that Jeremiah brings up that is that's really important for us is not only not fearing the season, but that also in the midst of the challenging seasons, the tree or the person does not recede. They do not fade. Isn't that fascinating? They do not recede. They do not fade. We're not talking about Superwoman or Superman who's just bucking up by their own power and overcoming all these obstacles on their own good. It is a solid determination in the midst of storms of life that says, this will pass. There is blessing on the other side and in the middle of it, and God's glory is greater than this earth's brokenness. That's what thriving looks like. It's determination, a determined posture on the basis of who God is. It's not about human production. Fascinating to me. What does thriving look like? A leaf that does not wither. And the second thing that Psalm 1 says, and we'll finish with this, is that it produces its fruit in its season. Now, I love this language, right? Because I love a beautiful picture of what humanity is supposed to look like. It doesn't say, this tree is crazy. It's producing fruit every day, right? It produces fruit in summer, in fall, in winter. It produces fruit in spring. It even produces double and triple the times of normal trees. It doesn't say that at all, does it? It says it functions like a tree. Imagine that. We have this wrong understanding of what the Christian life looks like, of what thriving looks like, that says we're going to become these uber mensches, right? These superman, superwomen who are going to be able to outdo and outperform everything and anything. And God actually says, you're going to be human again. You get to be human in the way that humanity is actually meant to be. Think about this for a minute. What is the picture of thriving? That the tree does what it's supposed to do. What is the picture of thriving for you and me? That we are human as we're meant to be human. We talked about this through the Fruit of the Spirit series, that a tree bears fruit so that it can reproduce and so that it can nourish the created world around it. That's what it means to be human. That's what we're called to do. To reproduce ourselves in helping other people find true humanity through the restorative work of Jesus, and to be a blessing to the world around us through the fruit that we bear. But how is it that this tree is free to just be a tree? Because the picture in Psalm 1 is not of an isolated tree. It can't be. Right? The picture is of a grove of trees. We don't see that because we're zeroed in on our individual lives in Psalm 1. That's what the psalmist wants us to see. But God's mission can't be accomplished in a solitary tree. It's accomplished in a grove of trees who are actually helping each other to live into that reality. How is it that you can be free to bear fruit in season? Because the trees around you are also bearing fruit in their season. And together, collectively, we're accomplishing the purposes of God. That is not yours to carry alone. We look at thriving and we say, oh, it must mean like incredible efficiency, massive production. That's an American gospel, not a divine gospel. God is inviting you back into what it means to be human again. True internal satisfaction from reconnecting to our calling and purpose and growing in it day by day so that we are fruitful in this world, steady and consistent, unreceding by the challenges of life, but fully interdependent with the world, with the trees around us. When we say thrive, this is what we mean. Can I pray with you? God calls us to thrive. Help us to grow, to move away from our rebellious, self-centered ways, and to fall on your mercy, to live in response to it. God, help us to thrive. Reconnect us to our human calling and mission. Not the ones we've created, but the ones you've given to us. Don't let us recede or fall back from any of it in our personal lives and in this church community. God, help us to thrive. Build up an inner contentment, the likes of which we've never seen, as we participate with you instead of attempting to consume from you. God, you have rescued us. Now, would you cause us to thrive?